252 million years ago, the Earth was at its peak, a planet overflowing with life, beauty, and balance. Across its surface, a single supercontinent called Pangaea stretched from pole to pole, surrounded by the endless ocean Panthalassa. It was a world both alien and familiar, filled with towering forests, roaring predators, and oceans glittering with uncountable shapes of life. The air was thick, warm, and heavy. Days lasted a little longer than they do now. The world turned more slowly, its rhythm steady, ancient. The sun rose over deserts the size of modern continents, casting red light across endless dunes. Winds carved the stones into curves and ridges that glowed like fire at dusk. At night, the stars hung low and bright, untouched by any trace of human history. The heart of Pangaea was a harsh furnace. Its inland deserts never knew the touch of rain, and its temperatures swung from freezing darkness to unbearable heat. But along its coasts, rivers twisted through green valleys. Forests of conifers, seed ferns, and cordytes grew tall as temples. Swamps shimmered with golden mist. Dragonflies the size of hawks darted between colossal ferns, their wings flashing silver in the half-light. In the oceans, life reigned supreme. Coral reefs rose like living cities beneath the waves. Trilobites, armored and enduring, crept across the seafloor in countless herds, while ammonites drifted through the water in slow spirals, their shells reflecting the sunlight like galaxies of glass. Shoals of primitive fish shimmered through the shallows. Predators with blade-like fins sliced among them. The water was rich with plankton and oxygen, alive with movement, rhythm, and song. The land had its monarchs too. Among the tangled forests and stony plains roamed creatures that blurred the line between reptile and mammal. The gorgonopsids, fierce hunters with long saber teeth and forward-facing eyes, ruled as apex predators. Beneath them crept dicynodonts, tusked plant-eaters that grazed in herds. Every sound, the rustle of ferns, the clicking plants grew twisted rings, their trunks warped from unseen stress. The soil near the coast turned darker, richer in metal. In the oceans, microscopic shells of plankton began to thin, etched by the first whispers of acid. The changes were too slow for eyes to see, too subtle for instincts to sense. The forests still swayed in the wind, the predators still hunted. The trilobites still crawled across the seabed as they had for hundreds of millions of years. But the planet was holding its breath. If you could stand there, on that ancient soil, you would see nothing out of place. The horizon would glow faintly red with dust. The air would hum with life. Yet the silence between the sounds would feel different, longer, heavier, as if the world itself was pausing, listening, waiting. Beneath your feet, magma surged closer to the surface, stretching the crust like skin over boiling water. The pressure was too deep to hear, too vast to measure, but it was there, pulsing like a hidden drumbeat. The forests swayed once more, unaware that their roots anchored them to a dying world. Insects hovered over stagnant pools, oblivious to the toxic gases seeping upward through cracks in the earth. Far out at sea, currents began to slow, stirring less oxygen into the deep. Tiny fish gasped in waters that were just a little warmer, just a little heavier. The balance was breaking, but no one knew. It was the calm before the storm, the kind of silence that lives in the space between heartbeats, the kind that hides the sound of something vast approaching. Soon the sky would darken, the seas would boil, the air itself would turn against life. But for now the world still breathed. The wind moved through the trees. Waves broke gently on forgotten shores. In the fading light, shadows stretched across Pangaea like slow, sleeping giants. The earth exhaled softly and prepared to die. At first it was only a tremor, so slight that it passed like a breath through stone. The ground shifted, thick as honey. Then the pressure found purchase. Pillars of fire rose, unsteady at the base, then steady, then relentless. Bombs of molten stone arced outward and came down smoking among the trees. Ash, shocked to whiteness by its own heat, lifted into the upper air and spread its black-edged veil toward the horizon. The Siberian traps began, not as a single catastrophe, but as a decision that the planet kept making, again and again, for centuries. Dikes of magma intruded like blades into buried forests. Sills slid between ancient sediments. Every intrusion cooked more coal, more peat, more petroleum locked in the crust. Every rising pulse released new storms of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide. The air learned the taste of them. The clouds learned their weight. On the surface, the forest burned in circles that widened with the wind. Pines snapped and sap flashed to blue flame. Soil curled, browned, and then became something else. Char, blass, a brittle grit that carried the memory of heat. In the rivers, fish rolled and gulped at the slick that settled from the sky. The water tasted of metal. Froth clung to the edges of reeds like the spit of some invisible animal. Nothing in the world understood cause and effect as we do. Things simply happened and continued happening. Rains came earlier than expected and stung the leaves. The needles of conifers blistered and fell. The webs of streams turned tea-brown, then black, as they washed the forest's carbon to sea. The haze that rose each dusk no longer reddened gently. It bruised the sky purple. At noon, the light looked tired. In the ocean, the changes moved methodically downward. The surface warmed first, by fractions, by degrees. Plankton bloomed in pale, luminous clouds and then died in sheets, their bodies rotting in a slow avalanche of invisible snow. Bacteria at depth gorged on this windfall and spent oxygen like money, stripping the midwater of its breath. The thermocline sagged. Currents dulled. Beneath a certain line, the sea went still and became land. The chemistry of the air shifted from rumor to rule. CO2 climbed until plants grew quickly, then desperately, then strangely. Leaf flesh thickening in curves that conserved water, stomata narrowing like a fist. SO2 reacted with water to make acid rain that gnawed the gloss from leaves and the polish from stone. The first true ozone wounds opened high above, too thin to see, too terrible to feel. Yet. Animals noticed the world in ways they understood. Thirst that came earlier in the day, a new sharpness in the wind, prey that tasted different as if fear had flavored its flesh. Herds moved higher on slopes that should have been too dry to feed them. Breeding seasons slipped by weeks and then months. The old rhythms struck with the regularity of a drum left in the rain. It would be wrong to say that everything went badly everywhere at once. Pangaea was too large, too various. While the north burned, some southern valleys were green as ambition. While one sea curled into an anoxic sleep, another sang with fish. But as decades became centuries, the pulses synchronized. The haze traveled, the warmth spread. the silent places grew. From time to time, a lull arrived, and the memory of normal life returned for a season. Plants seeded, hatched things hatched, waters cleared enough for light to cut more than a meter. Those reprieves were the most dangerous mercy. They kept every living thing confused. They sounded like hope and felt like reprieve and were, in fact, only the breath that a drowning world draws between waves. This is where an ordinary story would end the chapter. Ours does not. The earth was not content with heat and ash alone. It had more to say, and it would say it beneath the water. As CO2 climbed and the seas warmed, strange beds in the submarine cold, old, orderly lattices of methane clathrate softened and let go. Bubbles rose from the seafloor in fields of pale bells, at first a curiosity, then a weather pattern. Methane reached the surface and leapt into the air, an accelerant to a fire that had already found the curtains. What had been a century's change became a decade's. What had been a decade's became a year's. The coastlines began to taste eyelids half closed. Here and there a tree had been mummified by the heat, transformed into a column of charcoal so pure it shone. There were no ghosts yet, but there were outlines where ghosts would be. Weather staggered under the new rules. Summers baked until seed pods popped like distant rain. Winters bit hard, then swung warm and wet in a week, then froze again, an atmosphere drunk on its own chemistry, trying and failing to find a mean. Storms traveled along lines they had never known, dragging salt far inland and metal back to sea. The sky's colors learned new names. Far offshore, at depths where daylight is only a memory, oxygen slipped to zero. Bacteria that had always waited for this chance bloomed in plate-black curtains, turning sulfate to hydrogen sulfide. The water around them went green, then purple, then black, each color a grammar of poison. When currents lifted that water toward the surface, fish shot for brightness as if they could outrun chemistry. Their bodies washed ashore in windrows that crackled with flywing. On land, the apex hunters thinned first by inches, and only later by heads. A Gorgonopsid's litter produced 2 young that lived where once 5 had lived. Over seasons, the average weight of adults crept downward. Bone thinned. Tooth enamel recorded a childhood of fever and hunger in rings the color of smoke. Prey animals gathered in shadows for the sake of temperature more than safety. Many learned to be dusk creatures. More learned to be burrowers. None of it was enough. There were places of grace even now, pockets where the wind curled kindly through valleys, where groundwater tasted of stone rather than burning, where forests under old rains made their own weather and defended it with leaves. In those sanctuaries, a creature could live long and never know that the world was failing. But the sanctuaries were islands, and the tide that would erase them had already turned. From a ridge above a fresh basalt plain, the horizon looked like a thing invented by mathematics. Flat, hard, absolute. Heat danced above it. The ground underfoot clicked as it cooled. In the distance, another vent opened with the slow certainty of life, and the air, wounded from above and loaded from below, would finish what the lava had begun. But for a last few seasons, the world pretended not to know. Winds moved, rivers carried. In the valleys that knew mercy, young were born and some lived. In the north, the basalt cooled by microns. Ash settled into quiet layers that would become pages. The trilobite crossing a ripple of sand left a line that a future sea would not erase. The planet was writing carefully now, every sentence carved in heat and gas, every comma a storm. Anyone who could have read it would have understood. This was not a series of disasters. It was a process, a system remaking itself, and the cost would be almost everything that breathed. The first cracks had opened. The rest of the world would follow them down. It began with a color no one had ever seen before, green shading to bruise purple, a sheen that red as oil even where no oil had ever drifted. In the open ocean, the surface went dull, like a mirror breathed upon. Below that soft film, an old order failed. Water that had always traded its warmth with the sky, its salt with the rivers, its oxygen with the wind, fell still. The sea forgot its grammar and, with it, its promise. Heat had thinned the difference between layers. Currents stumbled. The long elevator that had carried cold, brightened water down and lifted the deep, spent water up, stalled at half height and shuddered. Life above multiplied recklessly for a season, drunk on light and warmth. Life below starved. The dead from the surface snowed down in a slow white weather that never reached the bottom, because the bacteria caught it mid-fall and spent it, and in spending it, they took the oxygen for themselves until there was none left to take. At first it was only a line, a depth beyond which breath failed. Fish hunting at dusk brushed that line and turned back, puzzled. Then the line climbed, season by season, as if the weight of the sea were shifting upward. Whole shelves of the ocean floor went quiet. Crabs left the mud as if the mud had learned to bite. Eels rose and rose, schools folded like dropped cloth. The slick of their bodies drifted to shore and piled itself gently, tidily, as if the world were keeping accounts. Birds came for the feast and left with throats that stung and feathers that stank of rot without flame. Some never left at all. Along the coasts, reefs that had been cities for 100 million years flashed from color to bone. Polyps retreated into their own architecture and found that architecture dissolving. The water that had mothered them became their solvent. In the lagoons beyond, seagrass lay down like hair in bathwater and did not rise. There is a tone that enters the wind when the sea is wrong. It is not louder, it is simply closer, the way a whisper at the ear is closer than a shout across the room. On shore, the smell arrived before the news. Eggs rotting in a cracked sun, struck metal, thunder trapped in a jar. The first storms that crossed that tainted water pulled H2S into themselves and carried it inland like a secret. The rains that fell afterward tasted strange, and not only because of sulfur. Up high, the gas met light and broke the sky's shield, ozone torn in thin gossamer wounds that widened with each eruption, each bloom, each new convulsion from the deep. Sunlight changed its character. It came down harder, straighter, with the indifference of a tool. UVB blistered leaves in a day, erased the transparent skins of eggs in an afternoon, wrote death in the clear bodies of plankton as fine snow of nuclei shattered and strands of life unwound. Toad spawn turned from onyx to milk and then to nothing. The skins of reptiles dulled and cracked where they basked. The ones that learned to bask less lived longer, and length was a new mercy. Forests dimmed as if a long eclipse had passed and forgotten to move on. Needles browned from the tips inward. Cones born that year opened and poured seed that would never find a year kind enough to welcome it. The understory became a place of shadows, not because the canopy thickened, but because the light that reached it bit rather than warmed. Chandeliers. The air was stale but not poisoned there. The light was absent but not punishing. Mothers licked eyes clean in that midnight, and fathers scraped at walls that did not care. There is no strategy in desperation, only repetition. Enough of them repeated it, and a future made of 4% began to take shape in the dark. On slopes of new basalt, life tried its smaller experiments. Lichens wrote pale maps on the cooling stone, their acids gnawing glass to grit. Microbes colored seepage, emerald and ink and rust. In those thin films, chemistry rehearsed surviving rules it would need for the next 10 million years. Farther upslope, a plant found a crack with a pinch of soil in it. Farther downslope, another died with its roots still holding a pebble the way fingers hold an idea. The repair crews of the world, humble, tireless, worked as they always had, but the demand outpaced the labor, and loss outpaced the invoice. Some bills can never be paid in full. There were nights that pretended to be ordinary. Stars were still stars. The Milky Way still poured from horizon to horizon like a river seen from a height. Wind stroked the grass where there was grass. In those hours, the mind of any waking creature, if it had a mind beyond hunger and fear, could be tricked into thinking that the story might tack back toward its old middle. Dawn corrected the mistake. Heat arrived early. Light arrived hard. A haze already stood over the valleys, and the far ridges wore the color of metal. From certain cliffs you could look down and watch the sea change expression in a single day. Morning's blue leaned to evening's bruise. Bubbles stitched a vast seam offshore where clathrates bled out their long-stored methane in silent syllables. Beyond that seam, nothing moved in patterns you would call a school. Closer in, the beach lay scalloped with fish heads and spines picked clean by beetles that glinted like drops of oil. The smell sat in the mouth and would not leave. Insects held on longest where the trees still read their old calendars. Their ancestry had taught them patience and numbers, but even their multitudes met a mathematics that those eddies, something small survived, and sometimes small was exactly the right size. The last part of any ending is arrangement. Ash arranged itself in layers that a future hand could read. The salt arranged itself in steps that would catch snow long after snows returned. Bones arranged themselves under silt in attitudes of sleep, and teeth kept their gloss. Chemistry arranged fleets of molecules that would wait out a century or 1,000,000 years until the water softened and the light gentled, and the air remembered its oath. Above ground, the world learned new quiets, not the peace of fullness, but the hush of less. Paths that had been worn by hooves blurred at the edges, pools that had known the snouts of generations filmed over and held the dimness like a secret. Where once a chorus of small lives had lifted every evening, a few syllables now tried the dusk and, hearing no answer, fell still. When the first true purple tides climbed the shelving shore and lay there through the night, the sky above them took another thin step toward nakedness. The sun the next day wrote its signature deeper. A lizard blinked and moved into a shadow that kept its promise for an hour. A burrower turned in its sleep. A single trilobite, far offshore and far below, scrolled its last line in wet sand that would harden to stone. Nothing announced this as an ending. It only ended. The Permian still had years to give up, and it gave them, stubbornly, one by one. But the shape of the fall was fixed now. Fire to gas, gas to heat, heat to bloom, bloom to rot, rot to poison, poison to light, light to silence. The law had become a loop. The loop spun until almost nothing remained inside it that could speak for the before. And yet, under stone, in shade, at margins, in experiments so modest they looked like mistakes, the next world rehearsed its first lines. Before the fire rose from the north, Earth lived in balance. 252 million years ago, a single giant continent, Pangaea, stretched across the planet into art. Fish swarmed in glittering schools that shimmered and twisted like thoughts made visible. On land, evolution had become bold. Therapsids, the warm-blooded ancestors of mammals, stalked the forests. Among them roamed the gorgonopsids, predators with long saber teeth and eyes sharp as ice, the apex hunters of their time. Beneath them, dicynodonts, tusked herbivores with squat, sturdy frames grazed across the plains. Their footprints pressed deep into the red soil, tracks that would fossilize into the memory of an age. The climate was harsh but predictable. Seasons turned with mechanical precision. Rain fell where it always had, droughts arrived on schedule. Pangaea's interior baked under fierce heat, but its coasts flourished with rain-fed jungles and floodplains. To the south, cooler forests thrived beneath golden skies. Even the deserts were alive with tenacity, plants with roots like spears, insects that drank the dew before sunrise, reptiles armored against thirst and wind. This was an Earth that had mastered equilibrium. Fires came and went, clearing ground for new growth. Rivers flooded, nourishing the plains, and withdrew to leave fresh soil behind. The oceans pulsed with oxygen, feeding endless chains of life. Every death became the seed of something new. From the poles to the equator, the rhythm of existence was perfect, endless, and blind. Pangaea was a land of contrasts, mountains like jaws, forests like lungs, deserts like heart chambers pumping wind instead of blood. Beneath the soil lay the archives of older worlds, coal from vanished swamps, oil from forgotten seas, limestone from reefs turned to stone. The crust of the earth was a library written in pressure and time, its shelves deep and endless. To the creatures that walked upon it, nothing seemed fragile. The air was heavy but kind. The rain carried minerals from the mountains, painting the rivers green. The seas sang with life, filled with the hum of respiration. Even night was full of movement, chirps, croaks, the hiss of scale through grass, the quiet labor of survival. If you stood there then, among those forests, you might have believed the world immortal. Against the crust. In the north, deep beneath what would one day be Siberia, pressure gathered. For millions of years, magma collected in silence, heat building, gases trapped, tension growing like a held breath. No creature could sense it. The forests above swayed in peace. The reefs below flourished, oblivious. The air was calm, the light golden, the days long. Life thought it had forever. But the balance of a planet is a fragile thing. A change too small to notice can rewrite the fate of everything that breathes. In the calm of the Permian world, as rivers ran and trilobites marched across the seafloor, the first faint cracks deep in the northern stone began to open. The planet was stirring, its pulse quickening beneath the silence of life. For now, though, all was still. The world was perfect, too perfect to last. Far beneath the quiet forests of northern Pangaea, something ancient began to stir. The crust of the earth flexed in slow, soundless waves as though the planet itself were breathing heavier. In that deep silence, magma, molten rock as bright as stars, pressed upward, gathering in secret chambers. The heat had been building for millions of years, trapped under layers of stone and coal, patient as destiny. Above, The world was unaware. The sky was still blue, the forests still green, and the rivers still carried silver threads of light across the land. Animals roamed without fear. Yet the ground beneath their feet had already chosen a different future. When the first fissure opened, it was almost delicate, just a hairline crack across the tundra. But within hours, the earth split wider, exhaling smoke that smelled of metal and fire. Then came the glow, an orange pulse that painted the horizon. The air trembled, and the sound that followed was not thunder but something older, a groan from the bones of the world. Lava poured out in sheets, moving slowly but endlessly. It spread over plains, filling valleys, turning lakes into cauldrons. Forests ignited before the flow even reached them, their sap bursting like gunpowder. The air thickened with ash and steam. The eruption wasn't a single explosion. It was a flood of fire that would continue for millions of years, trapping heat that could no longer escape. The planet started to sweat. Across Pangaea, the effects unfolded slowly but relentlessly. Deserts crept outward, swallowing meadows and forests. Rivers shrank to trickles. Insects swarmed, then vanished. Amphibians searched for cool waters that no longer existed. Even the winds changed. The great air currents that once brought rain now carried only dust. Far out at sea, the oceans began to warm. Layers of water that had always mixed freely grew still. The upper surface turned hot and heavy, pressing down on the cooler depths below. Life in those deep, dark layers began to suffocate. Tiny shells dissolved in acidified water, and coral reefs, the lungs of the sea, stopped growing. The change was slow enough that life kept pretending it could adjust. For every dying species, another tried to take its place. But the math was against them. Each new wave of lava released more gas, each rainstorm carried more poison, and each year the sky grew less forgiving. On land, the forests thinned. The air smelled of sulfur and rot. Tree rings shrank to a fraction of their old size, proof that growth had turned to survival. Animals wandered farther between meals, smaller and thinner with each generation. Dust storms swept through valleys once green, leaving behind silence and gray light. In the north, the fires never stopped. The ground cracked open in fresh scars, spewing lava that layered itself into cliffs of black basalt. The flows hardened into vast staircases of stone, one eruption stacked upon another, until the land itself rose like a monument to destruction. Even in the midst of chaos, life tried to adapt. Ferns sprouted from the edges of cooling lava. Burrowing creatures dug deeper where the air was still damp and cool. Insects laid their eggs under rocks to escape the burning light. But each reprieve was short-lived. The next eruption would undo what little recovery had begun. The planet's balance, once perfect, was tipping, and every new breath of gas pushed it further. The air was turning into a mirror, trapping heat against the surface. The oceans were turning into glass, refusing to mix or breathe. Still, to those living through it, the dioxide had balanced near 400 parts per million, enough to keep the world warm but stable. Now, that balance shattered. As lava boiled through ancient coal beds and petroleum layers, it freed the ghosts of old forests, old seas. The concentration of CO2 leapt past 2,500 ppm and kept climbing. The greenhouse thickened. The world's warmth no longer escaped to space. It circled endlessly, trapped in its own reflection. Average temperatures rose by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. At first, the heat was uneven, an unending summer in some regions, freezing drought in others. But soon the extremes synchronized. Deserts swallowed riverlands. Polar ice melted into vapor. The ocean's surface simmered, bleeding heat back into the sky. The dominoes had begun to fall. Every system that made Earth livable was tied to another, and the Siberian traps had struck them all at once. As the air grew thicker with carbon, the oceans began to choke. Warm water could no longer hold enough oxygen, and the great currents that circulated life between surface and depth began to fail. The sea lost its breath. At first, only the deeper trenches turned anoxic, black and silent. Then the shallows followed. Tiny plankton, the invisible foundation of the food web, began to die in clouds. When they decayed, bacteria consumed what oxygen remained. The sea turned dark and heavy, its surface glossy, its bottom rotten. And beneath the sea floor, a greater danger stirred. For eons, the cold pressure of the deep had locked away immense reserves of methane clathrate, frozen gas sealed inside crystal cages of ice. Now, as temperatures climbed, those cages began to melt. Bubbles of methane rose through the sediment, at first like whispers, then like storms. Entire slopes of the ocean floor began to boil with gas. The clathrate gun had fired. Methane, once released, was far more potent than CO2. It trapped heat 30 times more efficiently, amplifying the warming in a vicious loop. The hotter it became, the more methane escaped, and the faster the earth cooked. Rainforests wilted. Swamps evaporated into dust.
Ultraviolet radiation. Sunlight turned from life-giving to lethal. UVB rays seared the land, scorching plants to ash and blinding animals caught in the open. The forests collapsed in waves, and even bacteria struggled in the glare. The few survivors fled underground, into the shadows, or beneath the waves. It was a planet-wide chain reaction, one event triggering another, each more devastating than the last. Volcanoes begot heat. Heat begot methane. Methane begot poison. Poison begot silence. And through it all, the earth did not rage. It simply continued, obedient to its own physics, unfolding catastrophe as a matter of chemistry and consequence. In less than 60,000 years, a blink in geologic time, 96% of all marine species and 70% of land life would vanish. Coral reefs would not return for 10 million years. Forests would need twice that to reweave their green tapestry. Life had reached its lowest point. But extinction is never absolute. Even as the dominoes fell, a few fragments of life clung to the cracks, creatures that would hide, endure, and one day inherit the earth reborn. For now, though, the chain was still falling, and the planet had not yet hit the ground. The earth had begun to change its skin. In the north, under lands that would one day be called Siberia, the crust rose and cracked like the surface of an overfilled forge. From fissures hundreds of kilometers long, lava gushed in waves, spilling over itself, cooling, hardening, and then being buried by new fire. The ground glowed for centuries at a time. It was not an eruption that ended. It was an era of eruption. The Siberian traps expanded outward like a slow apocalypse, layer upon layer of basalt piling up until it covered an area the size of Western Europe. Each flow cooled into geometric columns, vast fields of black stone stretching to every horizon. When the molten rivers met water, explosions of steam shattered the sky. Ash clouds billowed into the stratosphere, where they drifted around the globe and blotted out the sun. At first, the darkness cooled the planet. Temperatures dipped, frost returned to valleys that had forgotten it. Rain fell thick and black with ash, clogging rivers and burying forests in mud. But soon, as the fires continued, the carbon in the air built up again, and the cooling gave way to fever. The alternation of cold and heat broke the world's rhythm. Species that might have survived one disaster found themselves trapped between two. Sulfur filled the sky. Carbon wrapped the globe. Oxygen in the seas bled away. Lightning stalked the storms like a predator, striking the same forests again and again until there was nothing left to burn. The smell of char and acid became the breath of the planet. The air was now a weapon, a chemical war fought between sky and sea. Every eruption fed the firestorm, releasing sulfur dioxide that turned to acid rain and carbon dioxide that thickened the greenhouse shroud. The winds, heavy with particulates, carried heat across the continents. Temperatures rose unevenly, but everywhere the extremes deepened. In some regions, daily highs climbed past 50 degrees Celsius. In others, drought followed flood in endless rotation. Even the poles, once the last refuge of coolness, grew warm enough for rain. Beneath this chaotic sky, life stumbled. Forests that had stood for millennia collapsed. Eruptions thinned to ribbons. For the first time in 500 million years, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation struck the land. Plants blackened in a day. Amphibians blistered in their own skin. The chain of life began to snap, link by link. What made the Siberian traps so deadly was not their size alone, but their persistence. Each generation that survived 1 century of eruptions faced another. Every pause was only a breath before the next surge of magma. For 2 million years, the planet's heartbeat was fire. Even the continents began to shift under the strain. The weight of lava depressed the crust. Earthquakes rumbled through the heart of Pangaea. Mountains collapsed. Fault lines opened where none had been. Rivers reversed their courses, turning inland seas into plains of salt. From orbit, Earth would have looked ill, its poles dark, its equator veiled in haze, its atmosphere tinted bronze. The line between ocean and land blurred beneath storms the size of continents. And yet, even in this age of ruin, life refused to vanish all at once. Insects hid beneath stones. Cynodonts, our distant ancestors, dug burrows in the cooling ash. In the ocean depths, a few species of bivalves clung to vents where chemical warmth replaced the sun. These remnants would carry the code of survival into a future they could not imagine. But for now, the surface belonged to fire. Every horizon glowed. Every breath carried ash. Every drop of water boiled away into steam. The Siberian traps had become a second sun, and the earth was trapped between its light and its shadow. The world no longer had nights, only hours when the glow dimmed. Over the northern plains, the horizon burned with a permanent twilight. Ash clouds catching the reflection of molten rivers that rolled endlessly from the Siberian wounds. The air shimmered with heat, dense with smoke so thick that stars vanished even when the sky was clear. The eruptions had become a heartbeat. Each pulse of magma rose from the Earth's mantle with the strength of continents. Each pause was short enough that for larvae, the amphibians that needed soft water to breathe. Soon even the great ones followed, the land filled with the smell of chemical rot. Across Pangaea, climate became chaos. Winds reversed, deserts expanded, and the sea level rose as polar ice turned to vapor. In the heart of the continent, storms of dust rolled for weeks, carrying with them the ashes of forests that would never return. The sky changed color with every season, gray one year, bronze the next, pale green when sunlight hit the haze at the wrong angle. And still the volcanoes roared. The fire broke through older flows, split mountains, and filled canyons. In some places, The molten rock met groundwater and exploded into steam that burst through the crust in geysers of shattered glass and boiling mud. The noise was endless, rumble upon rumble, the voice of a planet unmaking itself. For life on the surface, the rules of existence dissolved. Plants that once relied on predictable cycles of rain and sun now faced a world that refused pattern. Some species flowered too early and died before their seeds matured. Others held their buds forever closed, waiting for a season that would not come. Trees produced smaller leaves, thicker bark, desperate defenses against the air itself. But no defense could stop the acid, or the heat, or the ultraviolet light that now pierced the sky. The ozone layer, once the Earth's invisible shield, was thinning fast. The sulfur and chlorine gases belched from the Siberian traps chewed through it with ruthless precision. When the haze cleared between eruptions, the sunlight that poured through was raw and merciless. On open plains, the skins of reptiles blistered within hours. Fern spores fried before they could settle in soil. The surface of the planet became a stage for light to kill. Even the oceans began to steam. Warm currents surged into polar waters, melting what ice remained. Coral reefs that had glowed for millions of years turned ghost white, then disintegrated altogether. The sea became dense, still, suffocating. Fish fled toward the shallows where they died by the millions, floating belly up in tides that smelled of sulfur and death. And yet, in the distant growl of magma, it was in this silence that the planet crossed the threshold. Carbon dioxide rose beyond any level life had ever endured. Methane from melting clathrates joined it, multiplying the heat. The global average temperature surged again, this time without pause. From the surface to the sea, everything that could burn burned. The oceans released hydrogen sulfide in vast purple blooms that turned the water black. The gas rose into the air, carried by storms, spreading across the continents. Wherever it drifted, it destroyed life outright. It stripped leaves from plants, corroded shells, and poisoned lungs. And when it met sunlight high above, it erased what was left of the ozone, allowing even more radiation to descend. The world had become a closed system of destruction. Each feedback loop fed the next, fire creating heat, heat unlocking methane, methane amplifying fire. There was no reset, no recovery, only acceleration. The chemistry of catastrophe was perfect, precise, and merciless. In time, only the simplest organisms would persist. Bacteria in the deep sea, fungi in the shade of rock, and the few animals clever or lucky enough to burrow beneath the earth. Everything else, the forests, the reefs, the hunters, the giants, would vanish. The earth had turned against itself, and it did not stop. For 2 million years, the Siberian traps continued to bleed. The fires rose, fell, and rose again until half the world had burned. When at last the magma cooled and the skies began to clear, it would reveal a planet stripped bare, a wasteland of black stone, gray dust, and silence. But that ending was still far away. For now, the furnace still roared, and the earth burned itself alive. Morning arrived without blue. The sun pushed through a ceiling the color of tarnished brass and laid a hard white blade across the land. Leaves that had survived fire curled in minutes. Pools that had survived ash skinned over with iridescence and began to stink. The world had learned to live with heat and smoke. It was not prepared for light turned feral. High above the shield that once filtered the sun, the ozone that had been cities turned to chalk, then to grit. The upper meters glittered, but it was the glitter of glass,
surface hard. Beneath it, airless. Once each afternoon, a slow purple stain unfurled from the slope and crept shoreward, hydrogen sulfide rising from anoxic corridors, a chemistry proud of its new dominion. Fish met the stain and rolled. Crabs abandoned holes and walked in straight lines until they stopped. Seabirds skimmed low and came up coughing, their tongues a chemical pink. Storms carried that breath inland. Rain fell that smelled like matches struck under a blanket. Where it pooled, it left salt rings and a quiet no insect wanted to cross. The repair crews of the world, wind that mixed, currents that lifted, microbes that cleaned, still worked, but the ledger had flipped. Effort became mere delay. Delay had an end. The last forests did not fall like armies routed. They thinned. An understory became a rumor. A canopy became a net with bigger and bigger holes. The soundscape emptied by syllable, first the droning midges, then the evening chirr, then the crackle of small feet in leaf litter. Predators stood in places where prey had always passed and learned the geometry of waiting with no prize. Bone showed earlier in the year, teeth dulled without the polish of meat. Underground, the lesson rewrote itself as practice. Burrows deepened, rooms sprouted from tunnels, and airways angled to catch the few hours when the outside cooled. Lystrosaurus, barrel-chested, beak-faced, stubborn, scraped chambers big enough for two and slept, nose to tail. Cynodonts lined their nests with anything that held moisture, frond ribs, pith, the felt of fungi that grew where light could not. They woke when the light was weakest, foraged in a geometry of shade, boulder to ash stump, stump to sill crack, then backed into the earth when the day sharpened. Even microbes made their choices. On newly cooled basalts, lichens wrote gray runes where rain could still rinse the poison thin. In oozes along seeps, mats of bacteria layered themselves in greens and inks and browns, taking energy where they found it. Light when it was kind, sulfur when it was not. Under a few tough and quiet. Beetles ticked in the litter. A single gorgonopsid track, light enough to suggest an animal not yet starving, crossed damp sand and faded by evening. But pockets are islands, and islands drown when the sea is not water but climate. Light finished what gas had begun. The skin of the planet, leaf, bark, cuticle, hide, took the worst of it and failed. After that failure, everything else was arithmetic. Fewer seeds, fewer young, fewer adults, fewer chances. The loops that had kept life in motion tightened until they squealed and then snapped. It did not happen everywhere at once. It did not need to. What remained gathered at the edges of day, of maps, of endurance. Shade became architecture. Stone became medicine. Night became strategy rather than rest. The world did not end in flame, but in adjustment too small to celebrate and too vital to stop. 4 lives in 100 learned that a meter deeper meant survival, that a day skipped meant a line continued, that blindness was better than being seen by the sun. When the haze thinned on certain evenings, the sky revealed its old wealth as if to provoke a memory. Stars burned with the cold generosity they had always offered. The Milky Way spilled as if nothing on earth had changed. Under that lie, a trilobite somewhere, the last of its great practical nation, made a shallow furrow in the silt and did not rise. On a ridge of columned basalt, a plant the size of a hand unfurled 2 leaves and kept them low, as if reverence could help. By now the Siberian traps had written their argument in stone. Kilometers of black pages turned with lava's slow grammar. The atmosphere had answered with its own text, numbers rearranged, protections reduced, heat retained. The ocean had supplied the punctuation,
purple commas of poison rising from the deep, regular as breath. History was being set, lithified, archived. And yet, beneath stone lids, behind shadows, below the worst of the glare, time kept a few apprentices. Burrow maps passed from one generation, years of work done by small hands. It began quietly, the way endings often do. The sea that had once shimmered with light now lay dull and heavy, its surface reflecting nothing. Ships would have left no wake there, if ships had existed. Waves rolled slower as if the ocean had grown old. Beneath the calm, something far more sinister was taking shape. The deep waters, once filled with oxygen and life, had stopped breathing. The great circulation that had always pulled cool fresh water downward and lifted nutrient-rich currents to the surface was broken. The upper layer, heated and swollen with carbon, floated like a sealed lid, trapping everything beneath it. In the stillness, decay began to rule. When plankton and fish died, their bodies drifted downward, feeding bacteria that consumed the last traces of oxygen. The more they fed, the faster the ocean suffocated. A zone of black water expanded across the continental shelves, a spreading wound where nothing larger than a microbe could survive. Then came the color. At first it was faint, a blush beneath the waves, the mark of bacterial blooms feeding on what the world had lost. Soon the hue deepened. Entire coastlines turned the color of bruised wine. Rivers carried the stain inland, leaving streaks of violet on the stones. The culprit was hydrogen sulfide, born from the sulfur-eating bacteria that now ruled the depths. It rose through the water in clouds, killing fish, coral, and shell alike. It turned shells soft and bones brittle. Everything that touched it died and sank, only to feed the bloom that produced it. Seen from above, the sea glowed in eerie patches, purple and black, glimmering faintly where sunlight met poison. At night, it shimmered faintly green, the last defiance of life reduced to chemistry. Each tide carried death a little farther inland. Shorelines that had once sung with the chatter of life were silent. Crabs lay frozen mid-step. The air above the beaches was thick with the stench of rot, the mixture of salt, sulfur, and decay. Birds fell from the sky, their lungs collapsing when they crossed overturned waves. Lightning flashed across the sky, igniting the very air above the sea in bursts of blue flame. The Earth's carbon cycle, the silent rhythm that had balanced life for eons, was gone. There was no exchange, no renewal, only accumulation. The world's temperature rose past thresholds no living species had ever endured. Rainforests vanished. Coral reefs dissolved. Ice disappeared from the poles. The equator baked under a sun unfiltered by mercy. The oceans, instead of cooling the earth, began to cook it from below. For those who survived, the choices were few: go underground, dive into the deeper cold, or perish. In the northern wastelands, Lystrosaurs and small cynodonts huddled in burrows, waiting for the heat to pass. In the dim shallows, a handful of bivalves and worms clung to vents that still exhaled warmth from the crust. These remnants, the 4%, became the last flickers of Earth's endurance. Above them, the ocean fumed and darkened. From space, Earth no longer shone blue but violet-black, as if mourning its own reflection. Clouds curled and bled color. Lightning stitched the atmosphere together in relentless patterns. The sea had become a purple tomb, vast and silent,
sealing the planet in its poisoned breath. No wind, no wave, no song of whale or gull broke its surface. Only the soundless churn of gases escaping from below. The great dying was no longer approaching. It was here. And still, in that death, the laws of nature continued to work. Chemistry moved on, indifferent to the cries it could not hear. Somewhere far beneath the poisoned waves, bacteria still multiplied, and in their blind persistence, they were already shaping the dawn that would one day follow. Noon arrived like a blade. Where once sunlight warmed, it now scoured. The ozone that had sifted the sun's violence for 500 million years hung in ribbons and holes, torn by sulfur, chlorine, and the breath of a sickened sea. Through those wounds, UVB fell straight and hard. Green turned gray, flesh turned glassy. Water with mold. Across open country, plants tried the few tricks evolution had taught them for an enemy like this. Waxes thickened, pigments deepened. Growth clung low to stone to catch stray shade. For a month, some lineages prospered by being redder, duller, slower. By the next month, the rules had shifted again, and those gains were gone. Seeds went to soil in numbers that would have made a meadow even a decade earlier. Now they made a thin, promising dust that never kept its promise. Animals learned the new grammar in their bodies. Eyes clouded first, the clear corneas of amphibians, the soft lenses of juvenile reptiles. Even the compound mosaics of insects dulled as UV cross-stitched proteins into haze. Skin blistered, scales split. The lucky peeled and healed. The unlucky fed the dark economy of decay. Diurnal lineages learned dusk. Nocturnal ones learned narrower nights, venturing only where topography printed shade. The lee of a columnar basalt stack, the underside of a tilted slab, the mouth of a burrow just wide enough to admit a shoulder. The air itself changed weight. Heat pressed down. Humidity arrived wrong, at noon instead of dawn, as steam freed from young lava and warm seas bargained with dust for custody of the sky. Winds that had once delivered rain now dragged dry thunder and grit. Lightning stitched the horizon in bright, quick alphabets. Strikes found dead timber and made it deader. Strikes found methane slicks on tidelands and wrote blue fire across the wrinkled water. Soils, the quiet machinery beneath all things, faltered. Microbes that knit nitrogen into forms roots could drink lost speed in the acid and heat. Communities reassembled around fungi that liked the new order. Fruiting bodies rose in strange profusion after each black rain, gray towers and rust plates, a fungal spike marching across floodplains where forests once wrote the year in leaf. The smell of sweetness went out of the ground. The smell of wet cloth and coin took its place. Rivers carried the record. In freshet they ran tea-brown with tannins, then ink-dark with charcoal, then milky where ash dissolved and clay deflocculated in sour water. Larvae pupated under stone and whose adults flew only when shadows connected like stepping stones. But the refuge map had a tide, and the tide rose. Each clear day without haze bit deeper than a week of storm. Each storm moved another ledger from the column of living to the column of done. Feedbacks closed their loops. UV killed canopy. Lost canopy heated soil. Heated soil shed moisture. Dry ground fed dust. Dust dimmed rain and seeded acid. Acid broke roots. Broken roots could not lift water to leaves that had already lost their skins. Above the coast, air currents pushed sulfide breath inland in long, low sheets. It pooled in basins and lay there till dawn, an odorless floor a meter thick that everything taller than grass had to cross. Herds learned new paths,
and then forgot them when a night ran still and the pool climbed a slope and sat in the throat of a pass. Corvid clever reptiles mapped those dead places and skirted them on ridges. Their young forgot a line and paid the tuition for the species. Far north and south, where cool had always been a covenant, the treaty failed. Snow took ash as its partner and met sunlight like a dark mirror. Albedo, that old guardian, deserted the poles. Meltwater braided black lines over fresh basalt and ran toward seas that did not want it. On certain nights, the stepped provinces glittered with frost caught in column joints, a neat geometry of temporary mercy, gone by first light, the rock drinking heat like a thirst. The sky's color vocabulary narrowed. Blue became rare and suspect, a story the old told the young. Bronze and pewter were common. Purple belonged to the ocean and to storms that had learned to carry chemistry. Even darkness changed. Fewer stars pierced the aerosol veil, and when they did, they seemed closer and therefore crueler. Moon halos were ordinary. A night without one felt naked. And still the planet did what planets do. It integrated the onslaught. The salts cooled and shrank, cracking into hexagons that caught seeds when seeds returned. Ash became soil in slow chemistry. Salts washed and recrystallized and, in doing so, taught future roots where not to drink. The poisoned years were a small fog into cold air. A plant the size of a hand kept its leaves low and waxed, and let one new vein of green into the day. The poisoned sky did not relent, but it learned, as all tyrannies do, that resistance organizes at edges. The edges held. The purple oceans had claimed the surface, and the air above them was poison. What once sang, flew, or bloomed now belonged to silence. The planet itself seemed to sigh, its heat escaping in waves through a sky that no longer protected it. The age of open life was ending. But endings on Earth are never clean. Beneath the ash, inside stone and under the cooling basalt of the Siberian traps, the survivors waited. They were not mighty. They were not clever. They were the small, the hidden, and the stubborn. In the lowlands, the Lystrosaurs dug. Their claws, dull but strong, carved shallow tunnels into the gray soil. Inside they huddled together in damp rooms, their sides heaving slowly in the stale air. They slept through the worst heat, waking only when acid rain ceased and the temperature fell enough to forage. Their diet, roots, stems, the remains of ferns that somehow still grew, was barely enough to sustain them. Yet they endured, generation after generation, their numbers thinning but never reaching zero. Not far from them, the cynodonts, small, sharp-faced hunters, made narrower tunnels, weaving chambers deep enough to keep out light. They cared for their young, shared food, and survived by night. In their burrows they had warmth, cooperation, and something that looked almost like intelligence. The line that would one day become mammals had begun to learn its first lesson. To live, you must hide. The world above was not kind to those who dared remain. Forests no longer grew tall. The few plants that survived hugged the ground, their leaves thick with waxen pigment to deflect the sun's violence. Fungi spread through the ash, feeding on the dead and turning the surface into a strange gray carpet. The smell was not rot, it was chemistry, the odor of a planet rebuilding itself from ruin. The oceans, though, were beyond. Land was bare basalt. Rain pooled in the cracks, forming shallow lakes where strange new microbes began to multiply, pioneers of the next age. They fed on sulfur and iron, painting the rock with streaks of red and orange. To them, this new world was not a tomb, but a blank page. In the silence that followed the fire, time slowed. Each year carried less motion, less sound. The few remaining animals dug deeper, slept longer, bred slower. For millions of years the earth was ruled by nothing larger than a dog. And yet, the planet was not dead. Beneath the cooled lava plains, water still moved. In hidden caverns, minerals precipitated into crystal webs. The air, though toxic, began to change again, slowly losing its burden of carbon, drop by drop, absorbed into the new rocks of the Siberian traps. The earth had begun to heal itself in silence. The oceans, once black, began to pale as bacteria adapted to the poison. Tiny cells learned to feed on sulfur instead of sunlight. In that slow chemistry, the first threads of a new web of life began to weave. 10,000 generations of silence followed. And then, after 2 million years of darkness, the sun began to look gentler again. Clouds turned white. The first green returned to the plains, thin mosses, creeping ferns, and fragile shoots of new forests. The air, while still heavy, could once more be breathed. The Permian was over. The world that rose from its ashes would be smaller, stranger, but alive. In time, those burrowing survivors would crawl from their holes, blinking at a new dawn. They would inherit a planet remade by death. The age of the reptiles, the Triassic, was about to begin. The great dying had ended, but the memory of it would linger in every living thing that followed. It was written in the bones, in the blood, and in the caution that every creature carried in its sleep. Earth had died once, and learned that it could live again. When the fires finally faded, silence covered the planet like into nourishment. Their bodies, scarred and sunburnt, carried the last memories of an age that had burned itself to the core. In the northern wastes, small whiskered cynodonts hunted among the shadows of collapsed forests. Their eyes were wide for darkness, their movements quiet and careful. They shared their burrows with their young, fed them regurgitated roots and insects, and huddled close for warmth. They were not yet mammals, but they carried the blueprint, the patience, the care, the cooperation that would one day shape a new kind of life. Around them, the world was trying to remember how to breathe. The skies, once bronze with ash, began to pale. Rain fell again, not acid, but clean, the first in centuries. Each drop hit the basalt with a hiss and a promise. The oceans, still dark and deadly, began to calm as the sulfur clouds thinned. Slowly, light reached their surface again. Algae, those ancient architects of oxygen, stirred in the shallows. Where death had ruled, chemistry began to build again. Across the plains, fungi blanketed the ground in gray carpets, feeding on what was left of the old forests. From decay, they forged the first new soil. In that soil, hardy plants, like copsids, mosses, and the earliest conifers took root. Their leaves were small, their trunks twisted, but they were alive. Green returned to the black rock. The air was still hot, still thin, but it no longer seared. Days stretched long and silent, and the nights cooled enough for dew to form. Tiny insects, wingless, almost invisible, crept through the litter, feeding on spores. They would become the foundation of new ecosystems to come. In the oceans, life began again from the simplest forms. Bacteria that had survived in the deep learned to live in the shallows. They fed on sulfur, then on sunlight, and as they multiplied, they began to change the water itself, releasing oxygen into the depths. The purple seas slowly lightened to green, then blue. Fish would not return for millions of years, but the first steps had begun, beginning to move after ages of stillness. The planet itself seemed to sigh with relief. The volcanoes had fallen silent. The lava fields cooled into stone. The air, still scarred by carbon, began to thin its fever. And in that uneasy quiet, evolution started to whisper again. Each dawn brought something new, a fern frond, a fungus bloom, the soft scrape of claws against rock, the sound of survival. From those small beginnings, the earth would build again. The survivors did not know it, but their endurance had bought the future. The Permian world was gone forever. From its ashes, a new one would rise, one that would give birth to giants again, but never forget the silence that came before them. 10 million years after the Great Dying, the world was still scarred, but it had learned to breathe again. The air, once filled with smoke and sulfur, was now lighter, washed by rain that no longer burned. The basalt plains had cooled into dark, cracked mosaics, and on them, green was returning, not as forest yet, but as courage. From every crack where dust gathered, ferns and mosses pushed out like quiet rebellions. Their roots crept into the stone, splitting it grain by grain. Tiny spores drifted on soft winds, seeding new life wherever they landed. The first fragile ecosystems formed, patches of green that fed insects, that fed lizards, that fed small hunters who had waited too long in the dark. The world's silence began to fill again. Overhead, the sky regained its blue. Clouds moved with the grace of old times, no longer burdened by poison. Rain fell soft and clean, leaving the air smelling of stone and growth. Rivers returned to their beds, carving through layers of cooled lava, carrying silt and minerals into valleys where seeds could take root. The land, once black, was turning brown again, the color of promise. The Lystrosaurs still ruled. For 1,000,000 years more, their kind wandered across Pangaea in herds that stretched for miles, digging, feeding, sleeping, and moving on. They were slow but steady, fragile yet unyielding. Their burrows dotted the landscape like scars of survival. They had no predators. None had survived the fire long enough to hunt them. But by the 5 millionth year after the extinction, the world had changed beyond recognition. Forests of ginkgos and conifers rose along the rivers. Insects swarmed again, buzzing through the golden air. Amphibians returned to the swamps, croaking into the dusk. It was a world smaller than before, simpler, but fiercely alive. Each sunrise was a rehearsal for a new age. In the shallow seas, coral tried again. Tiny reefs began to form on the ruins of the old ones. Shellfish and ammonoids crept back into the light, painting the seafloor with movement. Fish, fewer and stranger than before, swam through waters still streaked with sulfur. The ocean's wounds were healing, but the memory of poison lingered in its chemistry. Above the waves, storms still carried the scent of ash, a ghost of the Permian. But in their wake, the world glittered with new color. Green returned to the coasts. Purple flowers, mutations of ancient spores, bloomed under sunlight filtered through a recovering sky. For the first time in ages, the planet smelled of life again. The survivors had become builders. The Lystrosaurs plowed the earth with their digging, creating soil where there had been only dust. The cynodonts hunted the insects that devoured young shoots, keeping balance without knowing it. Fungi broke down old roots and fed the new. Even death now served purpose again. Evolution, silent through the fire, had resumed its song. In time, the first true predators of the New World appeared, sleek, upright archosaurs that hunted in packs. Their claws gripped the cooling rock, their eyes gleamed gold in the half-light. They chased the young Lystrosaurs across open plains, bringing motion back to an earth that had forgotten what it was like to run. Life had restarted its clock. It was a humbler world, but it was working. Oxygen levels rose, carbon began to lock into new stone and plants. The climate stabilized, still hot but livable. Where lava had once flowed, forests now whispered. Where acid rains had fallen, rivers now glittered with life. And beneath all of it, evolution, horizon to horizon, life was busy at its work of rebuilding. The age of rebirth had begun. Across Pangaea, the continents still formed one vast body of land, stretching from pole to pole. But now it was stitched with color, patches of green returning where ash had once fallen, bands of red desert meeting new forests of conifers and ginkgos. Grass had not yet evolved. The ground was bare and rough, but dotted with hardy shrubs and low ferns. The scent of pine and resin carried through the wind. The Lystrosaurs, once rulers of ruin, were fading. They had served their purpose, eating, digging, surviving long enough for others to inherit the world. Their numbers shrank with each generation, their forms smaller and weaker, until their burrows stood empty. When the last one fell asleep beneath the soil, it left behind not silence but opportunity. And something new had been waiting to take that space. The archosaurs, swift, upright reptiles descended from survivors of the extinction, were spreading fast. They filled every niche the planet offered. Some stalked the rivers on 4 legs, heavy and low like the first crocodiles. Others stood tall, running on 2 legs, their tails straight, their movements like balance perfected. Their lungs were deep, their hearts strong. They were built for the new thin air of the Triassic. They were in every way the architects of a new world. The land echoed again with pursuit and flight. Small archosaurs hunted across open plains where ferns shimmered in the heat. Packs moved with the discipline of thought, communicating with hisses and body language, striking together, eating quickly, moving on. The smaller cynodonts watched from the edges, learning caution, learning patience. The oceans, too, had changed. The surface glittered blue once more. Coral and shellfish had returned, building new reefs atop the bones of the old. Fish, though smaller, darted through the water in brilliant silver clouds. In the shallows, amphibians croaked beneath the shadows of towering horsetails. And far from shore, the first marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs, slipped through the waves like living arrows, perfectly adapted to a world reborn. The sky, once a curtain of poison, now with teeth shaped for tearing flesh. These would one day give rise to the first true dinosaurs. In the forests, cynodonts adapted in their own quiet way. They hunted insects, guarded their young, and warmed their bodies with the heat of their own blood. The line that had once burrowed through ash was learning the beginnings of fur. Their eyes glowed in the dusk. Their hearts beat faster. They did not yet know it, but they carried the blueprint of the future mammals. The balance of the planet was still fragile. Volcanoes still rumbled. Droughts came and went. But compared to the chaos of the Great Dying, this world was paradise. The carbon was locking back into stone. The air was sweetening, and life once again moved in rhythms that made sense. For the first time in tens of millions of years, The Earth was not surviving, it was thriving. On a quiet plain where lava had long cooled, a new kind of predator paused, head lifted, eyes bright. Its form was sleek, tail balancing each step, claws tracing the dust. Around it, the wind carried the scent of ferns and prey. It was not large yet, barely taller than a human's knee, but its kind would grow. They would inherit this planet of stone and sun. The era of reptilian architects had begun. They would fill the skies, the seas, and the land. They would build an empire of muscle and bone, of teeth and thunder. They would rule for over 150 million years. And all of it, every roar, every wing beat, every heartbeat, would rise from the ashes of one single silence. The day when 96% of life had vanished, and the 4% had refused to give up. From extinction came domination, from death came design, and from ruin, the Earth began again. 10 million years after the Great Dying, Earth had transformed from a graveyard into a workshop. The scars of lava had cooled into stone, the skies had cleared, and the seas had found their breath again. Life, cautious and stubborn, had reclaimed its rhythm. What had once been silence was now the slow heartbeat of renewal. Across the vast continent of Pangaea, the world was taking its first deep. Every creature alive was the descendant of those who had endured, the ones adapted for hardship, for scarcity, for patience. There were no giants yet, no forests thick enough to darken the sky. But the foundations were strong. On the plains, the Lystrosaurus still wandered, but fewer now, their rule nearing its end. They grazed among the low ferns while newer creatures watched from the shadows. Their thick bodies and dull tusks were relics of a harsher time, their strength now outmatched by agility and speed. As they dug and fed, they churned the soil, unknowingly preparing it for the forests that would replace them. From their burrows emerged the cynodonts, small, warm-blooded hunters. They darted between rocks, their fur thin but growing thicker with each generation. Their young stayed longer with their mothers. Their teeth were sharper, their movements quicker. When night fell, they hunted insects and small reptiles, guided by keen hearing and smell. In their bones lay the future, the blueprint for mammals. But it was the archosaurs who truly defined the age. They had risen quietly from the ashes and now ruled the land, sky, and water. In the swamps, some archosaurs grew heavy and low, armored like living fortresses. Their limbs sprawled wide, their jaws widened into crushing maws. They were the ancestors of crocodiles, built to wait in stillness, strike with speed, and outlive disaster. On the plains, others walked upright, balancing on powerful hind legs, tails stretched straight behind them. They were fast, predatory, and calculating. Their kind would evolve into the first true dinosaurs, but for now, they were hunters of opportunity. Small, graceful, relentless. The oceans, too, had begun their resurrection. What had been a suffocating black void now shimmered again with color. Algae and plankton painted the water green and blue, feeding new chains of life. Coral reefs grew cautiously on the skeletons of their ancestors. Fish schools glimmered in the light. Above them, marine reptiles, the nothosaurs and early ichthyosaurs, cruised through the water, sleek and silent, filling the roles that ancient sharks once held, that would one day rule both land and air. Farther north, the air cooled. Forests of ginkgos and cycads stretched across valleys. The nights grew longer, and frost returned for the first time in millennia. The world world's engine was running again, circulating heat, cold, rain, and renewal. The earth had rebuilt itself from ruin, but not into its old form. This was not the lush chaos of the Carboniferous, nor the humid jungles of the early Permian. This was a leaner, sharper world, an arena for new experiments. Every species alive was both survivor and prototype, and among them, the Archosaurs began to dream bigger. Their bones grew lighter, their lungs more efficient, their hearts faster. Some climbed trees, others took to running in herds. A few even stretched membranes of skin and caught the air, gliding for the first time. The sky, once a sentence, was becoming a home again. 10 million years after near-total extinction, the planet had rebooted. The chemistry of life was writing its sequel. Soon, the first true dinosaurs would rise. Soon, the world would belong once again to thunder, motion, and the hunger of giants. But in this quiet moment, the earth rested. It had burned, bled, and suffocated. Now it healed. And as it healed, evolution sharpened its tools, ready to carve the next age of wonder from the bones of catastrophe. The world had given them every reason to fail, and yet they rose. From the ashes of extinction, the Archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, stepped forward as the architects of the Triassic Earth. They were not the largest creatures, nor the oldest, but they were built for change. Every fiber of their being spoke one truth: adapt or vanish. They were the children of fire and scarcity. Their ancestors had survived the great dying not by chance but by design. Lungs that drank deeply of thin air, hearts that beat fast to endure heat, bones light but strong enough for motion. In a world that had punished giants, the Archosaurs were made to move. At insects that swarmed in the warmth. They were the first to move upright, balancing on hind legs, tails stretched for counterweight. These would one day become the progenitors of dinosaurs. They didn't roar yet. They hissed, they stalked, they learned. Evolution was teaching them to run faster, breathe deeper, and think sharper. Above them, the air shimmered with heat, and something extraordinary began to unfold. Some Archosaurs, smaller and more delicate, climbed rocks and cliffs, spreading skin between their limbs to glide from tree to tree. They were awkward at first, falling as often as they flew, but each failure shaped their wings. In those leaps of instinct, the first dreams of flight were born. The Triassic sky had found its new engineers. The land was no longer quiet. Herds of early herbivores, descendants of the few survivors, moved slowly across plains of cycads and horsetails. Behind them, the predators followed, learning teamwork, timing, and cunning. Tracks crossed in the soft mud, telling stories of pursuit and escape. The air itself carried new rhythms. Thunder rolled across the plains. Rain fell, heavy and kind. The ozone layer, rebuilt over centuries, softened the sun's glare. The earth had found its balance again, and in that balance, competition thrived. From the soil rose new forests of conifers and seed ferns. From those forests emerged insects larger than any seen since the Carboniferous. And among them, the Archosaurs hunted and evolved. Each generation grew more refined. Their limbs straightened beneath their bodies, allowing longer strides. Their lungs evolved air sacs, giving them energy for extended chases. Their hearts developed divided chambers, letting warm blood flow faster. They were rewriting the rules of what reptiles could be. While older species clung to the past, sprawling, slow, cold, the archosaurs invented the future. They were efficient, enduring, restless. They didn't wait for the environment to calm. They thrived in its volatility. When droughts came, they endured. When floods returned, they adapted. Slowly, power began to shift. The great predators of the Permian were gone, replaced by new. Every age of life, dominance is temporary. What rises must adapt or fall. For now, the archosaurs ruled, their shadows stretching across continents, their claws carving the path of evolution. But in the cracks of the world they built, another destiny was forming, one that would outlast even them. The earth had learned to rebuild. The archosaurs had learned to reign. And life had remembered how to dream again. In the warmth of the early Triassic sun, Earth's recovery had turned into ambition. What began as survival had become conquest. The archosaurs, once small and wary, were now experimenting with scale. Evolution, having found stability again, began to build large. The blueprint of giants was being written. It started subtly, longer limbs, deeper chests, faster hearts. Each generation stretched the limits of endurance. The air was still rich with carbon dioxide, feeding the forests that cloaked the rivers and basins of Pangaea. Ferns stood tall again. Conifers reached for the light. There was space now, and abundance. And where life finds abundance, it grows bold. In that boldness, evolution rediscovered size. Across the floodplains, herds of early herbivores grazed on the new forests. Their bodies were squat, their skulls beaked, their limbs thick. They were survivors' children, built from the hard lessons of the Permian. But behind them, stalking in the dappled shadow of cycads, came their future. Sleek, warm-bodied predators whose every step whispered precision. They were proto-dinosaurs, the first forms of a lineage that would one day tower over the world. These early hunters moved unlike anything before them. Their bodies lifted fully off the ground when they ran. Their tails, once used for balance alone, became counterweights of speed. Muscles along their spines rippled like cords of steel. And inside them, lungs with branching air sacs pushed oxygen through in one continuous stream, a system efficient enough to fuel thunder. It was not a single species that invented the giant, but a process, a language written in bone and motion. Every adaptation carried forward the lessons of survival. From the Permian predators they inherited power, echoed by dolphins and whales long after the dinosaurs vanished. Far above the forests, the air itself began to host ambition. Among the cliffs and high canopies, gliding archosaurs tested the wind. Their bones hollowed, their forelimbs lengthened. Membranes of skin stretched wide. With each generation, gliding became flight, and flight became mastery. The pterosaurs had arrived, the first vertebrates to claim the sky. The earth had finally restored every frontier, land, sea, and air. It had taken 10 million years of rebuilding, 10 million years of small beginnings and slow healing. But now, at last, the planet was vibrant again. Each niche was alive, each element in motion. The silence of extinction had been replaced by the noise of evolution at full stride. From desert to coast, Pangaea throbbed with life. Herds thundered through fern valleys. Crocodilian forms glided into rivers. Predators watched from ridges, waiting for the right moment to strike.
Insects hummed through the air like living dust. The cycle, birth, death, renewal, had resumed its perfect order. And yet, hidden within that harmony was the seed of another imbalance. The giants that evolution was crafting would one day consume the world's stability as surely as the volcanoes once had. Growth demanded energy. Energy demanded climate, and climate, as the earth knew too well, could turn. But for now the world was young again. The skies were clear, the seas alive, the land green with courage. The archosaurs ruled as architects and kings, the prototypes of all dominance to come. Their bones carried the story of both destruction and design. Their blood still remembered the fire of extinction. When they roared, it was not only hunger that spoke, it was memory. The planet had been remade in their image, fast, strong, efficient, and unyielding. And in that image, the next epoch waited, the age of giants, when the ground itself would tremble under footsteps born from the ashes of the great Triassic landscape. Their roots reached deep into volcanic soil, drawing strength from minerals forged in fire. Ferns filled the undergrowth, and moss spread in carpets where water pooled. The air, once deadly, now smelled of sap and rain. But this was a lean world. The abundance of the Carboniferous was gone. There were no swamps thick enough to choke the air with humidity, no jungles to block the sun. Instead, Pangaea was a patchwork of extremes: arid deserts in the center, lush valleys along the coasts, and frozen poles where darkness ruled half the year. The heart of this supercontinent was a furnace. Here, the sun scorched the ground until even stones cracked from the heat. Sandstorms marched across the plains like armies, burying everything in their path. And yet, even here, life persisted. Small reptiles scuttled between rocks, their scales reflective to deflect the sun's glare. In dry riverbeds, amphibians buried themselves in mud and slept through the drought. In the rare oases, conifers clung to existence beside shallow pools, their roots wound deep in search of moisture. Evolution had turned suffering into specialization. Farther north, the world was gentler. The temperate zones of Pangaea were the laboratories of recovery. There, rivers cut through conifer forests, feeding lakes that mirrored the clean sky. Herds of dicynodonts and early rhynchosaurs grazed along the water's edge, tearing up ferns and seed plants. Behind them, sleek archosaurs watched with patient hunger, testing their strategies in the dance of predator and prey that had begun anew. Everywhere, life was small, but determined. It was as if the earth itself had sworn not to waste another chance. Over millions of years, the ecosystems knitted themselves together like scar tissue. Fungi decomposed fallen trees. Insects pollinated the first flowering plants of their kind. Rivers carried minerals from the volcanic highlands into the floodplains, nourishing growth. Every storm that passed left the world greener than before, and yet, balance was a constant struggle. The climates ruled the climate. Lightning raked the plains with fire. Thunder shook the canyons of basalt. Rain fell in torrents, flooding valleys and washing life from one basin to another. In this chaos, the planet's circulatory system, the exchange of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, recovered its pulse. Slowly, oxygen levels rose to nearly what they are today.
For the first time since the extinction, breathing became easy again, and with oxygen came ambition. Creatures grew larger, faster, bolder. Forests stretched farther inland. The earth, though scarred, was no longer a patient. It was an athlete, testing its strength after surviving near death. But every recovery carries its own risks. Stability breeds complexity, and complexity invites collapse. The planet, still volatile beneath its crust, was far from peaceful. Volcanoes slept lightly, and the climate remained one spark away from upheaval. For now, however, the earth flourished. The great dying was a shadow in the bones of every living thing, but its lesson had been absorbed. Life is fragile, but it is relentless. Across the world, from the deserts of the equator to the forests of the poles, the survivors of the Permian were no longer simply surviving. They were building the future. The blue of the ocean deepened, the green of the forests darkened. The sky, once bronze, turned true. And somewhere, beneath a canopy of ferns, an archosaur lifted its head toward the light, unaware that it carried in its blood the design for the greatest creatures the earth would ever know. The long road to recovery was nearly complete, but evolution was just getting started. The Triassic world was alive again, but it lived on the edge of a knife. Every breath, every rainfall, every flicker of green came at the mercy of a planet still uncertain of its own stability. The scars of the great dying had faded from sight, but not from the rhythm of the earth. Beneath the calm, fire still pulsed. The supercontinent Pangaea was both a marvel and a curse. Its sheer size distorted the planet's winds and waters. Summers burned with unbearable heat, winters froze eggs before they could hatch. Drought starved the prey they relied on. When the rains came too hard, their burrows drowned. For every species that thrived, 2 others vanished. It was evolution in overdrive, an age of experimentation and failure. The forests reflected the same fragility. Along the coastlines, ginkgos and seed ferns reached high, their roots gripping volcanic soil still warm beneath the surface. But in the continental interior, vegetation lived fast and died young. Each season brought fire, drought, and regrowth. Charcoal lines in the soil told the story of forests that never lived long enough to grow old. Fire had become part of the planet's heartbeat. Lightning storms swept across the deserts, igniting dry ferns that went up like paper. Smoke carried seeds into new territories where rain later coaxed them to sprout. Out of destruction, renewal came, but the cycle left no room for complacency. Insects and amphibians flourished where moisture lingered. Dragonflies, the size of a human hand, glided over temporary pools. Early frogs clung to the edges, their eggs floating in clusters. When the heat returned, they dug into the mud and waited. Everything in the Triassic seemed to know one rule: endure or disappear. The oceans, too, danced on the edge of change. The water shimmered blue, but beneath its beauty, chemistry conspired. Algae blooms fed by volcanic carbon darkened entire coasts. When they died, decay stole oxygen from the depths, creating pockets of death that drifted through the seas. Marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, nothosaurs, and their kin followed the currents, hunting in zones where life still dared to breathe. The reefs, rebuilt with patience, remained delicate. A single shift in temperature could bleach miles of coral. Yet each generation grew tougher, their symbiosis with algae stronger. The ocean was relearning resilience, molecule by molecule. In the air, the first pterosaurs claimed their dominance. They were small at first, no bigger than hawks, but they flew with a precision unknown before. Their hollow bones and wide wings carried them across valleys and rivers, searching for insects and fish. Success came at a cost. The more they conquered, the more they consumed. Populations swelled, prey dwindled, ecosystems tipped. The balance that had taken 10 million years to rebuild began to sway again. The cynodonts, the small mammal-like reptiles that hid in burrows, sensed it first. They had seen this pattern before, prosperity followed by collapse. While the archosaurs grew bolder, the cynodonts dug deeper, waited longer, and stayed quiet. Evolution was teaching them patience, the strategy of those who survive giants. Storms grew heavier, summers hotter. Carbon crept upward once more. The feedback loops that had restored the Earth were now turning against it, and yet life pressed on, oblivious to its own fragility. To the archosaurs, the world was theirs. To the oceans, balance had returned. To the forests, every regrowth was proof of eternity. But the Earth never forgets. Beneath the peace, the mantle still whispered, the gases still gathered, the cycle still turned. The Triassic world was alive, yes, magnificent, defiant, unstoppable. But its balance was as thin as glass. And like all glass, it was meant to break. The Triassic sun hung fierce over the plains of Pangaea, a molten coin blazing through haze. It cast long shadows across rivers that glittered like knives, and deserts that breathed heat like a forge. To the creatures walking this world, it seemed eternal, a planet healed, a paradise reclaimed. But every paradise on Earth is temporary. Every age of greatness begins on the bones of what came before. This was the age built on ashes. The surface of the world looked complete. Forests climbed the valleys again. Ferns blanketed the lowlands. Rivers wound through the scars of old lava flows, turning black stone into gardens. The air was sweet with oxygen. Insects hummed, amphibians sang in the shallows, and predators stalked with practiced grace. The great dying had become a memory buried under millions of years of rebirth. And yet, beneath the roots, beneath the water, the earth still whispered, walked before. Every stride was balance, every breath a rhythm. They were not merely reptiles anymore. They were motion given purpose. And they learned quickly. In the Triassic's arms race of survival, the dinosaurs' design was perfect: fast metabolism, efficient lungs, sharp senses. They could hunt in daylight or darkness, in heat or cold. They could endure where others failed. In them, evolution had found its masterpiece. For a time, the world flourished under their rise. Insects pollinated forests that reached new heights. Ammonites painted the oceans in spirals of color. Coral reefs spread like kingdoms beneath the waves. The planet, for all its volatility, thrived. But deep within the cycle of creation, destruction was already stirring. Each gain carried a cost. The more oxygen plants produced, the more carbon they drew from the air, cooling the planet. The cooling shifted the monsoons, starving the deserts. Forests shrank in some regions and burned in others. Rivers dried, then returned as floods. The balance was delicate, a dance of chemistry and chaos, and the mantle beneath Pangaea grew restless again. The ground began to rise in strange places. Fissures cracked across the land, thin at first, then yawning wider. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, an old familiar warning.
It was as if the earth itself was stirring in its sleep, remembering what it had done once before. But life, blinded by abundance, went on. The cynodonts, now small and furred, lived among the roots of trees, their young mewling in burrows. The archosaurs towered over them, the rulers of this new empire. They fought, fed, and multiplied beneath skies that seemed endless, and all around them the planet shifted quietly, preparing its next act. Because every age of life is built not on safety, but on borrowed time. The Great Dying had ended, yes, but extinction is not an event. It is a rhythm, a heartbeat that pauses, recovers, and returns. The Triassic world, for all its splendor, was fragile, a miracle balanced on a knife edge of fire and stone. The very continents that gave it shape were beginning that destruction, the chemistry of the air, the rhythm of the oceans, the balance of carbon and heat are the same laws that rule us now. The Permian extinction was not magic nor mystery. It was physics, geology, and consequence. It began with carbon. When the Siberian traps erupted, they filled the sky with gases invisible but merciless. Carbon dioxide flooded the atmosphere, trapping sunlight that could not escape. Global temperatures climbed by 10 degrees. Ice vanished from the poles. Forests dried and burned. The oceans grew warm and heavy, unable to breathe. Methane, frozen for eons beneath the sea, thawed and joined the air, amplifying the fever. Sound familiar? Today, we walk beneath the same laws, guided by the same chemistry. But this time, the volcano is us. Every factory, every engine, every furnace built to fuel our progress exhales what the ancient world once feared most. The same gas that ended the Permian, CO2, now pours into the sky from billions of chimneys and exhaust pipes. In the age of the Siberian traps, it took 2 million years to raise the carbon level beyond safety. Humanity has done it in less than 2 centuries. In the Permian, CO2 climbed to 2,500 parts per million. Today, it is already past 420 and rising faster than any time in geological history. To the untrained eye, the world still looks stable. The skies are blue, the forests green, the seas vast and alive. So it was, too, in the first decades of the Siberian eruptions, before the tipping points fell like dominoes. The climate does not announce catastrophe. It accumulates it. During the Great Dying, warming did not kill directly. It changed the ocean currents, the chemical balance, the oxygen cycle. The seas turned acidic, coral vanished, fish suffocated. The food chain collapsed from the bottom upward. When the oceans die, everything follows. Today, acidification is again gnawing at coral. The currents are shifting. The deep sea, once a sink for carbon, is releasing it back. The oceans are growing warmer, less oxygenated, more unstable. We are watching the early stages of what the Permian once proved inevitable. Back then, methane, the hidden gas of Earth, does not forgive acceleration. When change comes too fast, ecosystems cannot follow. The ocean's chemistry lags behind. Forests die before they can adapt. Species vanish before they can migrate. The Siberian eruptions reshaped the climate over tens of thousands of years, and even that was too much. Humanity is compressing the same magnitude of change into a single lifetime. For now, we still live in the calm before the threshold, the deceptive stillness that ancient Earth knew well. The forests still breathe, the seas still shine. But the chemistry has shifted, and the numbers tell the story long before the weather does. The Permian taught one final truth. The planet always recovers. It is life that doesn't. After the Great Dying, the Earth rebuilt itself, but it took 10 million years for complex ecosystems to return. 10 million years for coral,
to reappear. 10 million years for forests to knit together again. 10 million years of silence. If the same process began today, if the climate were pushed past recovery, humanity would not wait it out. We would vanish long before the planet healed. The Earth does not need saving. It will continue. What it cannot promise is us. And yet, this time, the difference is choice. The volcano is human-made, the fire industrial. Unlike the Permian world, we can turn the valves. We can slow the heat. The story of the Great Dying is not prophecy, it is memory. It does not foretell what will happen, only what does happen when a planet's balance is broken and its inhabitants look away. We are living at the edge of another turning point, one measured not in millennia, but in years. The numbers rise. The storms grow stronger. The oceans climb the coasts. The same chemistry, the same trajectory, the same silence before the collapse. The question that the Permian cannot answer, and only we can, is simple. Will we remember what happened last time? The past is never gone. It lives in layers: rock, ice, bone, air. When the wind moves over the Siberian plains, it carries whispers from the deepest chapter of Earth's memory. Those rocks still breathe carbon. Modern world has drawn the same line in decades. Then, as now, the first signals of collapse appeared not in forests or deserts, but in the oceans. Plankton, the invisible foundation of food chains, began to decline. Coral reefs, those architects of marine life, bleached and crumbled. The water grew warm, stratified, still. Beneath the surface, zones of death spread outward, silent but unstoppable. In the Permian, it began in the tropics. Now it begins there again. Fish migrations shift toward the poles. Oxygen deserts form off the coasts of Asia and the Americas. Dead zones bloom where rivers carry fertilizer and heat into the sea. What was once a world of blue abundance is becoming patchwork, a map of oxygen and emptiness. In the Great Dying, this process reached a point of no return. When the deep ocean stopped circulating, hydrogen sulfide gas rose from the abyss. It poisoned everything it touched and tore the ozone from the sky. We have not reached that threshold yet, but the pattern is there, the first faint mirror of an ancient end. Above the water, the atmosphere hums with the same imbalance. Carbon climbs faster than ecosystems can absorb it. Forests, once the lungs of the world, now burn each year with the force of volcanoes. The smoke carries black carbon into the sky, warming it further. As in the Permian, each feedback loop feeds the next. Warming begets drought. Drought begets fire. Fire begets more warming. Even the numbers match their ancient counterparts. Average global temperatures have risen by nearly 1.5 degrees Celsius since the dawn of industry. The Permian's catastrophe began at 5 degrees Celsius. Between those two numbers lies the distance between hardship and collapse. And beneath it all, methane sleeps again, locked in ice beneath Arctic seas, the same fuel that turned the Permian world into a furnace. Every thawed permafrost, every warming seabed whispers of that sleeping giant. We think of extinction as distant, but it begins quietly, invisibly. Species vanish not with explosions, but with absences. A sign of what happens when life outruns the planet's limits. The echo is growing louder. Storms rise in unfamiliar places. Ice vanishes from the poles. Forests turn to embers. Oceans acidify. The same sequence, the same warning, the same beginning.
The question is whether we will let the echo become an answer. When geologists study the end Permian layer, they find a band of black shale rich with carbon, a physical record of the moment when the biosphere choked on its own breath. It is thin, only a few centimeters thick, but it marks the boundary between two worlds, one alive, one almost gone. If humanity continues its current path, we will leave a layer too. Future species, if any rise after us, will find a thin stripe of plastic, soot, and ash, and they will name it after the same pattern, a time when one form of life overwhelmed the rest. They may not call it the Great Dying. They may call it the second one. But the story does not have to end that way. The Permian teaches not despair, but scale. It reminds us how vast and indifferent the earth can be, and how fragile the fabric of life truly is. But it also reminds us that recovery is possible. After the Great Dying, it took 10 million years for balance to return, but it did return. The biosphere rebuilt itself from almost nothing. If life could recover from that, it can recover from us. But whether we remain part of that recovery is the only question left to answer. The earth has burned before. It will burn again. That is the rhythm of a living planet. Destruction, renewal, balance, and loss. But in this age, for the first time in 4 billion years, the keeper of that fire is not a volcano, not the core of the earth, not even the sun. It is us. We are the volcanoes of the modern age, breathing carbon, remaking the atmosphere one exhaust plume at a time. What the Siberian traps unleashed by accident, humanity now releases by design. The question is no longer whether the earth can survive us. It can. Or power. They survived because they changed. They went underground, slowed their hearts, altered their habits, and waited. From their humility came the blueprint for all that followed. Dinosaurs, birds, mammals, us. Adaptation saved the world once. It can again. The choice of fire is not whether to burn, but what to ignite, destruction or renewal. The same forces that can ruin a biosphere can also rebuild one. The same ingenuity that split the atom can power the sun in our cities. The same species that destabilized the climate can stabilize it. We stand at the edge of a mirror. On one side, the memory of extinction, purple seas, dead skies, a silence that lasted 10 million years. On the other, possibility, a planet that learns, a civilization that chooses not to mimic the volcano, but to outgrow it. The difference will be measured not in centuries, but in decisions. What we burn, what we protect, what we choose to remember. The Permian extinction was written in magma and ash. Our extinction, if it comes, will be written in data and negligence. But the story does not have to rhyme with the past. The same chemistry that can poison can also heal. Carbon pulled from the sky can be stored in stone. Energy can come from the wind, the tide, the stars. Forests can be rebuilt faster than they burn, if we choose to grow them. The earth has already given us the script, not as prophecy but as instruction. When the Great Dying ended, life began again from the humblest places, the dark, the cold, the forgotten. It did not rebuild the old world, it built a new one. The Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, all those ages of light and motion, were born from what once seemed permanent night. That is the pattern. That is the promise. Even now, beneath our cities and oceans, the same persistence hums. Forests reclaim ruins. Coral breeds in silent bays. Seeds lie waiting for rain. The planet still remembers how to heal. It is we who have forgotten. The great dying began when the earth could no longer balance what it produced against what.
Listen.